Pierre-Marie Félix Janet, born May 30th, 1859, was a pioneering French psychologist, physician, philosopher, and psychotherapist, working in the areas of dissociation, the unconscious, and traumatic memory. Pierre Janet was a contemporary of Henri Bergson, and there are many parallels between their works. I kind of think about it as similar to the relation between Leibniz and Newton, who both independently, to some degree, invented calculus, although there are questions about if they influenced each other. Well, very similarly, it seems that Bergson and Janet both influenced each other, but also independently were working and came to many of the same ideas, especially about psychology and about the unconscious. And both of these thinkers actually did research on hypnosis, much more Janet than Bergson. Bergson did some early research before moving more squarely into philosophy. And Pierre Janet, on the other hand, started in philosophy and went in the direction of psychotherapy. And he was interested in phenomena where consciousness is breaking down, or we could say disintegrating. This is his term. So he looks at hypnosis as a way that automatic thoughts are happening without conscious awareness, waking conscious awareness, being in control. And on this level, suggestion is strong enough that it results in action. So the hypnotist implants things using suggestion in the hypnotized, and they enact these things. And they can even get people to walk around, sleepwalk. So it's artificial sleepwalking. Also things like giving them a suggestion that when they wake up, they execute thinking it's their own volition, right? So you tell them, if I pull out this coin, you're going to stick it in your pocket. And then you pull out the coin, they grab it and stick it in their pocket. And then you question them, and they make up a reason. They don't know why they did it, but they make something up, and they think that they were supposed to do it. And then you tell them this was part of the hypnotism, and they're, flabbergasted by the fact that they had thought that. So these are really interesting cases that they were looking at and learning about consciousness in the process. And so we can kind of put all of this under the umbrella of automatisms. Automatisms are compulsive actions, things we do without noticing it. This involves things like distraction. He gives the example of you're pouring tea while talking to someone and you don't notice that it's overflowing. And then all of a sudden you notice, right? So things where you start an action or you fail to notice something, which includes everyday human phenomena like habit, right? We get certain habits and they become compulsive. They become automatisms. Passion is another. And Genet understands passion to mean things like addiction, drugs, alcohol, sex, things like that. And through all of these studies, a very complex and dynamic view of the psyche comes about, in which the unconscious plays a major role. Our everyday conscious states are complexly layered and include both conscious awareness, things that we're actually aware of, as well as many automatisms or mechanisms or drives or tendencies that arise outside of our conscious attention and our will. And furthermore, the state of normal consciousness, being aware of our surroundings, having a sense of what's going on, acting, responding to people, all of that is actually a very high order of emergence of different organizations within our psychical awareness. We have, physiological needs that need to be met. And on that, there are sensations. If the physiological situation is under control, then we get sensations. And with sensations, we can develop perceptions. And then from this, we can develop a further layer of consciousness or psychical experience, which is emotions and feelings. And then we can open to higher intellectual functions like recognizing something through memory or thinking and abstract reasoning using symbols and interpretations. And so Genet was interested in understanding how consciousness integrates and disintegrates, how it can form these organized systems of psychological facts and mix that together with a set of unconscious tendencies. And Genet's idea is that we have all of these automatisms, all of these tendencies that need to be held in check by higher tendencies. So we have these fundamental ones that if we don't have these higher functions holding them in check, then they will run wild and lead to what he calls psychological misery, the inability to keep our psychical state even keeled, we might say. Either our sensations overwhelm us and are too intense and we can't, keep our head on straight. Or on the other hand, our memories do this. So the psychical health of a person is all about balancing how much stimuli they are distracted by, we could say, and how many memories they are distracted by. Many of these maladies arise from an inability to unify and coordinate our experience. And Genet refers to this as mental weakness and strength. Here's what he writes in his doctoral thesis, which was in 1889, mind you, the same year that Bergson published his doctoral thesis, Time and Free Will. Genet says, there's a particular mental weakness which consists of the powerlessness of the weakened subject to collect and condense her psychological phenomena, to assimilate them. A weakness of assimilation of the kind has been given the name psychological misery, and we propose to call this mental ailment psychological misery. A bit further down, the hysteric has subtle senses which are constantly being exercised, and a rich memory in which all the images of the past and all the psychological systems organized in the past live indefinitely. But at the same time, she has an organizing capacity like that of a child, one mentally disabled. She does not know what to do with her fortune. She forgets, she throws out feelings and memories at random and lets them play out as they please. She is like a mediocre administrator at the head of a large factory who forgets her duties and who leaves her employees without supervision, free to do what they want, and her machinery to run wild. In such a psychological state, all the attacks which we have described, and which are the consequence of automatisms of the psychological elements, become possible and occur frequently. They have a particular character. They are extremely changeable. The same enduring state of psychological misery allows the atomic play of elements to take on all forms. Another characteristic trait deriving from this weakness is that it is very easy to artificially modify the nature of the attacks or to form the automatism takes at any given moment. The mind of the subject has extraordinary plasticity. End quote. All of these cases have a similar effect of opening the mind to a greater amount of unconscious factors and the production of images, of memories, mental fixations. All of this is an inability to repress what is actually a normal activity. The goal should not be to limit the person's mental capacities, to sedate them. It is not to get rid of this, but to reinstate these higher orders of organization that hold them at bay. There's something like a weakening of the grip of one's psychical life on reality. And when this happens, the dreamlike state open to all the past and imagination can run wild or get stuck in certain ruts, mental fixation, the idée fixe, being stuck in one idea and being unable to get outside of ruminations. So therapeutic methods ought to work to reconstruct these layers of organization within the patient's psychical life. And Pierre Janet develops one of the first developmental models of this process and understands it through tendencies of lower and higher orders. He suggests that maybe there is a tendency and a habit, an unconscious remembering going on within our organs. Our heart has learned to beat and the lungs learn to breathe, and all of this happens as if it was habits and psychological functions lived from within that has a real spiritual being to it. Janet says he agrees with these ideas, but that they are beyond the scope of our observations. And so all we can say with certainty within this context are things that we can observe and phenomena such as distraction, instinct, habit, and passion. And he moves on to look at each of those phenomena in succession. And here's what he says about distraction. We say that a person is distracted when they do not see or hear something that they should see or hear, when someone unknowingly performs an action which they should not have consented to had they been aware of it. A preoccupied person will chase a fly from their face without feeling it, answer questions they have not heard, or like Buren, Duke of Cortland, who used to put parchment in his mouth, destroyed an important trade treaty without having examined it. Who has not heard stories of people who, as they are talking at the table, continue pouring water until they have soaked the guests, or continue to add sugar to their cup to the point of filling it? There are countless anecdotes similar to these. Systematic anesthesia and subconscious acts are the two characteristics which we have reported among patients. Only distraction can arise in healthy people for different reasons. Sometimes it is due, as with patients, to a narrowing of the field of consciousness caused by fatigue or to half sleep. Quote, "Day of misery and extreme despondency," writes Mandabiron in the curious journal in which he studied experimental psychology on himself. Quote, "I had dinner with the Chancellor. I found myself in a state of disorder, of embarrassment, of momentary deafness. I am like a somnambulist in the midst of this cheerful and light world, dissatisfied with others because I am with myself." But the same distraction may be due to an excessive concentration of thought. On the other hand, to a significant focus of attention, which, without narrowing the actual thought, displaces the field of consciousness. The same author writes, referring to Deleuze, when he spoke about somnambulance, "I am almost always connected with myself, and I see too much within to see well without." End quote. But in both cases, a certain number of psychological phenomena are left to themselves and develop according to the laws of their own automatism. As soon as phenomena are isolated in this way, either by extreme attention or by distraction, they bring about reverie, sometimes even hallucination. We hear chanted words in the ringing of the bells. We see the people we are thinking of, or make abrupt gestures and speak out loud. All these psychic reflexes have been studied elsewhere when they were isolated and magnified. It suffices to recall that they also play a considerable role in the attitude and physiognomy of very normal persons. These kinds of activities account for the instinctive acts, which play an important role in animals, although they are quite rare in humans. It is impossible to suppress consciousness in instinct and to make it a pure mechanism, but neither can it be made into an intelligent and voluntary act. Lemoyne says it is likely something intermediary between the movement of raw matter and that of the human will. Instinct is very similar to acts caused by suggestion, and just as these were only the manifestations of a phenomena of perception, we can say that instinct is activity directed by perceptions which are clearly conscious in the animal and even forming the whole of its mind, whereas it is almost always subconscious in people whose minds are filled by higher phenomena. So in this example given by Janet, quoted from Mandabiran, the problem is the excessiveness of thought precludes the narrowing of our consciousness and therefore disrupts our consciousness. We can't stop thinking, and this makes us distracted and dissociative, if you want. Despondent. People call despondent teenagers sleepwalkers all the time. Basically, these states are not the actual emptying of the mind, but the mind just being too much for normal consciousness to be able to stay focused and attentive on the things going on around them. And he ends this passage that I just read by looking at various psychic reflexes and their relation to instincts. And he says something very close to Bergson's ideas of instinct, which is that the instinct is conscious and it is a very precise form of knowledge, almost like intuition. And it is only in more rare cases of humans that instincts become unconscious. And Bergson even says somewhere that they are perhaps not unconscious in principle, but only unconscious with respect to the unity of the person and our ability to weave our conscious states and memories together. In our normal consciousness, higher functions, higher phenomena are taking the attention away from these lower conscious states that are in line with our lower tendencies and instincts. Okay, I'm going to keep reading here. He says next, in humans, automatic activity has become concentrated in the phenomena of habit or memory. As we have pointed out before, we are not looking to see if our memories subsist in a conscious manner within us, which is not improbable, for this goes beyond our experience. We only recognize that our habits and our memories lead to acts, connections of ideas that we witness beyond what we actually generate, which are often outside of our consciousness and always outside our will. Conscious phenomena are not suppressed because we can regain consciousness of things that we hold in memory or that we do out of habit. But consciousness is neglected as if these phenomena can be sufficiently exercised when they are harmlessly left to their own devices. Geoffroy rightly says, quote, habit seems to dull the organ or it sharpens it, but the fact is that it neither sharpens nor dulls it. The organ remains the same sensations are reproduced. But when these sensations are interesting for the soul, it applies itself and becomes accustomed to disentangling them. When they are not, it becomes accustomed to neglecting them and does not disentangle them. End quote. These ideas, entrusted to memory and habit, are sometimes sharper than those of consciousness itself. To find the spelling of a word that we have forgotten, we let our pen automatically write, almost in the way mediums interrogate their spirits. This forgetting of the phenomena, giving over to automatic memory, allows us to consciously think of something else while they are independently carrying out with perfect consistency. I remember, wrote Erasmus Darwin, quote, having seen a pretty young actress rehearsing her singing part with the great taste and delicacy while she accompanied herself on the pianoforte under the eyes of her master. I saw on her face an emotion for which I could not divine the cause. At the end, she burst into tears. I saw then that during all the time she had been singing, she had been watching her canary, whom she loved very much, who seemed to suffer and who, at that moment, fell dead in its cage. End quote. As for simultaneous intelligent actions, I do not include, as the author does, the beating of the heart, the movement of the breath, which continued during all this time. Yet this person sang, accompanied herself on the piano, likely played different notes with both hands, and still used all her conscious intelligence to follow the stages of agony of her canary. Neither mediums nor somnambulists have shown anything this complicated. This aptitude which habit gives us to perform intelligent actions without personal perception allows us to make new progress and to use our intelligence for greater things. This psychological automatism is the necessary condition of our progress. The study of habit leads so naturally to the notion of automatic and subconscious acts, which many authors can only describe by using the hypnosis of two simultaneous personalities. Cognac's description is especially interesting for us. Thus, he says, there are, as it were, two selves in each person, the habitual self and the reflective self. It is this first which touches, which sees. It is the one which directs all the animal faculties. Its object is to accompany the body, to keep it from harm, and to watch continuously over its conservation. The second, leaving all these details to the first, focuses on other things. It occupies itself with adding to our happiness, its success multiplying its desires. The former is responsible for that which makes an impression on the soul. Ideas, needs, and desires, which establish in the body the corresponding actions necessary for the conservation of the animal. The latter is excited by all things, which, by stirring our curiosity, multiply our needs. Although each has a specific purpose, they often act together. When a surveyor, for example, is very busy with the solution of a problem, objects still continue to act on our senses. The habitual self, therefore, obeys its impression. It is the one who crosses Paris and avoids obstacles, while the reflective self is entirely devoted to the answer it is looking for. The habitual self is sufficient for needs which are absolutely vital for the conservation of the animal. The measure of reflection that we have beyond our habits is what constitutes our reason. End quote. In this context, this description undoubtedly has only the truth of a metaphor, because the conscious phenomena which develop automatically in habit are not grouped and synthesized in the average person so as to form a second self, as in hemi-somnambulance. However, in our previous discussions, which are impossible to reiterate here, we learned that despite this exaggeration, there is more truth in this description than in most common opinion, which describe automatic and habitual phenomena as simple physiological movements. So Pierre Janet is saying some really interesting things about habit here. A lot of it is in line with Mandebiran, Ravesson, and things in Bergson. And, leaving aside for now psychoanalyzing why Erasmus Darwin is talking about this actress's body, let's look at this story, which is actually really interesting, about how intelligence can work on multiple levels at the same time because of habit. So, playing piano is already a synergetic activity that requires multiple systems working independently to create multiple voices on the counterpointal melody lines, and simultaneously paying attention to the situation around her and singing, and is capable of doing all of this while fully conscious of what is going on in front of her, the dying of her pet. And that is an incredible feat. We can, I'm sure she was still monitoring her ability to play the piano. She was probably monitoring her body from creeps like Erasmus looking at her. She was doing 10 things in her psychical state at once, juggling multiple patterns of organization and extremely complex ones. So our automatisms are not all bad. They're not all maladies. Some of them are our greatest achievements. Our ability to craftily pull together all of our psychical capacities and our bodily capacities and to execute them in concert, to organize a multiplicity of different actions at the same time and independently of each other. All right, I'm going to continue reading now and looking at passion next. The most curious manifestation of psychological automatism in the average person is passion, which resembles, much more than one generally imagines, suggestion and impulsion, and which, for a moment, lowers our pride and reduces us to the level of the insane. Passion, strictly speaking, that which drives people in spite of themselves, thoroughly resembles madness in its origin, in its development, and in its mechanism. Everyone knows that passion is not dependent on will and does not come when we want it to. For example, to fall in love. It is not enough to simply want it. On the contrary, the voluntary effort that we might try to make, the reflection and the analysis in which we might engage, far from bringing love itself, irresistible and blind, would infallibly move away from it and produce completely opposite feelings. Likewise, it is in vain that one might try to invoke in oneself feeling of ambition or jealousy. No matter how much you dare declare these passions useful or necessary, you would not experience them. Another characteristic, which seems to me to be less known and less analyzed by psychologists, is that passion can only emerge at certain moments, when we are in specific situations. It is commonly said that love is a passion to which we are always exposed and which can surprise us at any time in our life from the age of 15 to 75. This does not seem correct to me. A person is not all their life at any time likely to fall in love. When someone is in good health and in good spirits, they have complete and effortless possession of all their thoughts. They can expose themselves to the circumstances most capable of giving rise to passion, but will not feel it. Desires will be reasonable and voluntary, leading a person only as far as they want to go and disappearing as soon as they want to be rid of them. On the contrary, if someone is mentally ill, whether it is as a result of physical fatigue or excessive intellectual work, or else after violent tremors and prolonged grief, if they are exhausted, sad, distracted, reserved, unable to gather their thoughts, in a word, depressed, they will fall in love or take on the seed of some passion at the earliest and most futile opportunity. Novelists, when they are psychologists, have understood this. It's not in an instant of gaiety, boldness, and good mental health that love begins. It is a moment of sadness, languor, and weakness. anything is sufficient. The sight of anyone, a gesture, a word that would have left us completely indifferent a moment before, to strike us and become the starting point for a long love affair. Even more so, an object which had made no impression on us at a moment when our healthy mind was immune and produced an insignificant memory can reappear in a moment of morbid receptivity. That is enough. The seed is now sown in favorable soil. It will develop and grow. First, as in any virulent disease, there is an incubation period. The new idea goes back and forth in the vague reveries of the weakened consciousness, and then seems to disappear for a few days and lets the mind recover for its transient disorder. But it has accomplished its underground work. It has become powerful enough to unsettle the body and cause movements whose origins are not within personal consciousness. What is the amazement of a man of intellect when he finds himself standing pitifully under the window of his beauty, where his unsuspecting, wandering steps transported him, or when, in the middle of his work, he hears himself continuously murmuring a name, the same one, over and over. Let us add that every idea brings about expressive modifications throughout the body, which are not always appreciable to others, but which the tactile and muscular senses transmit to consciousness. How great, then, must the nervous irritation of the mind be, which constantly feels its rebellious organism initiating actions which it has not been ordered to do. Such a genuine passion, not idealized by fanciful descriptions, but reduced to its essential psychological characteristics. In fact, we find these same characteristics in all kinds of passion. Taking a more liberal interpretation, let us look at a very specific and well-known passion, that of fear. When you are healthy, reasonable, and in good spirits, you are not fearful, and the things that are said, the dangers that surround you, are elevated by you with calmness and composure. You defend yourself, you take precautions. This is reasoning and not fear. However, when you are weak, sorrowful, and ill, you now feel your legs preparing to flee, the beating of your heart, your face turning cold. You find yourself, like the famous coward of Topfer, looking under your bed and checking the lock for the 20th time. It is then that you feel the anguish of dread and the indomitable fear. If we turn to another far less passion, the smoker's passion for tobacco, we find in an article of Delboeuf a confession which has all the merits of a psychological document. Quote, "The tobacco jar sits at some distance from me in its usual place. I feel its pull. Suddenly, I get up and unconsciously walk towards it. I perceive my weakness. I sit down and resume my reading. Now my hand mechanically plunges into my pocket and pulls out my cigarette case. Irritated with myself, I violently return the case to its place, etc." End quote. As with suggestion, fixed ideas, or impulsive madness, passion is not an error. For an error exists entirely in the personal mind and can be fought and destroyed by it, while passion has its origin outside the personal mind and cannot be suppressed by reasoning. No matter how irrefutably we are shown that this love is absurd, that this fear is ridiculous, we remain convinced of it. We will remain in love or frightened. Passion is sometimes cured when it is satisfied, when the fixed idea has definitively brought about the act to which it corresponds, is exhausted, and disappears. It can also be cured by a new shock, which once again upsets the layers of consciousness and allows us to reclaim the ideas that had been separated. Is this brief description of passion not the exact reproduction of what we have observed so many times among the insane and hysteric after having received a suggestion? With them, too, a state of momentary weakness of consciousness has made it possible to sow a foreign idea which is not integrated into their judgment and their will. The ideas develop independently, in spite of themselves, and cause them to perform acts of which they are sometimes unaware, but which, in some circumstances, they accept and continue. They may occasionally somewhat resist them, but in any case, they always remain foreign to them. We really do not need to take hashish, as Moreau did, to know for ourselves what madness is. For who can boast of never having been mad? The subconscious action of certain ideas during passion is so evident and clear to see that it has given risen to a quantity of moral expressions known throughout time. The battle of two men which share our heart has been described in all religions and philosophies. The charming author, during the moments of rest that his great, quote, voyage around his room, end quote, leaves him, has drawn such a perfect description of the system, of the soul, and the beast that I cannot resist the pleasure of recalling it here. I realized, he said, quote, through various observations, that man is made up of a soul and a beast. These two beings are absolutely distinct, but so embedded in one another, or on one another, that the soul must have attained a certain superiority over the beast in order to make the distinction. One day last summer, I was on my way to go to court. I had painted all morning, and my soul taking pleasure in meditating on the painting. I left it to the beast to transport me to the king's palace. Painting is a sublime art, thought my soul. Happy. It is the one that the spectacle of nature has touched. While my soul was making these reflections, the other was going on, and God knows where it was going. Instead of going to court, as it had been ordered to do, it drifted far to the left, so that by the time my soul caught up with it, it was at the door of Madame Horcastel, half a mile from the royal palace. I leave it to the reader to think what might have happened if it had itself come upon such a beautiful day. I usually give my beast the care of the preparations for my lunch. It is the one who toasts my bread and slices it. It makes wonderful coffee and even makes a quite often without my soul getting involved unless it chooses to watch the beast work. I had laid my tongs on the coals to grill my bread, and sometime later, while my soul was wandering, a flaming piece of it rolled onto the hearth. My poor beast put his hand to the tongs, and I burned my fingers. End quote. Here, one should recall the whole episode of the portrait of Madame Horcastel. Quote, my hand had automatically seized the portrait of Madame Horcastel, and the other amused itself by removing the dust which covered it. This occupation gave it a quiet pleasure, and this pleasure made itself felt in my soul, although it was lost in the vast expanses of heaven. Her whole figure seemed to be reborn and to emerge from nothing. My soul rushed from the heavens like a falling star. It found the other in the ecstasy of beauty and succeeded in increasing it by sharing it. End quote. And elsewhere still, quote, Janetti, his domestic, is a perfect, honest man. He is accustomed to the frequent journeys of my soul and never laughs at the inconsistencies of the other. He even directs it sometimes when it is alone, so that we could say that it is led by two souls. When it gets dressed, for example, he warns me with a sign that it is about to put on his stocking inside out, or his coat before its jacket. My soul has often amused itself to see poor Janet running after the madman beneath the supports of the citadel to warn it that it had forgotten its hat, or another time its handkerchief or its sword." End quote. What better summary could I have made of the automatism of our thoughts in distraction, habit, or passion? To describe these phenomena further would be to repeat studies already carried out. So close they are to the phenomena observed during illness and somnambulance. And so I'm going to just end here by reading a few more quotes from the last section of Janet's psychological automatism on judgment and the will, and to summarize a bit his ideas here. So I'll start by reading the first paragraph of this last section of his book. He says, "What separates the normal person from these weak-minded individuals is that they have other actions in addition to the automatic activity which they both share. For suggestible people, we are in a state of psychological misery. Automatism influences all aspects of their life. It only exists within us in certain inferior acts which are habitual or passionate. It is then completed and taken over by the will. It is not necessary to study the higher or voluntary activity itself. We only have to demonstrate its existence and show how it differs from previous activities." And Janet begins by looking at the difference between voluntary and involuntary acts, and looks at thinkers such as Spencer and Wundt and Bastian, and says that every voluntary act and every involuntary act involves some idea or representation of the movement performed. So all possible movements executed by a living being will end up being voluntary movements, and this is obviously not the case. So he says, all of our studies have shown that there is no action, even among sleepwalkers or cataleptics, which is not either preceded by or accompanied by the representation of the act to be performed, because it is precisely this representation which brings about the action and the movements. Continuing to read, "Shall we say, like Romanes in his work on the intelligence of animals, or like Delboeuf, that there is a greater interval of time between the idea and the act which follows it, when it is a voluntary act rather than an automatic act, and should the will be made to consist solely in hesitation? It suffices to say, then, that certain clearly automatic acts, like those which we have suggested to somnambulants, will be carried out very slowly because of the resistance which they encounter. The hesitation arises simply from the struggle of several ideas which oppose one another before the strongest one has triumphed. This struggle can exist in mechanical or in other types of action." Janet then moves on to look at effort, and to see if effort can be a place in which we can distinguish between voluntary and involuntary. And he brings up a number of thinkers who have bet everything on this idea of effort, he says, such as Mandelbrot, and a large number of other philosophers around him, he says, founded a whole philosophy on this sensation of effort. But he quickly goes to William James and says that William James' study, The Feeling of Effort, sort of ends all debates on this topic and looks at the fact that the same muscular sensations are involved in voluntary and involuntary movements. So then he says, well, if even though this is the case, that the sensation of voluntary and involuntary makes no difference, perhaps effort is still required before our act. No matter how sincerely I want my arm to move, no matter how much I repeat my volition, however insistent and strong it is, my arm will remain inactive until I apply the driving force myself by a particular effort. And now, quoting Janet, this amounts to saying each individual sets their arm in motion with specific images, muscular for one, visual for another. If they are successful in a manner which remains quite vague, in representing the movement of their limbs with different images, there will be no real movement, at least not in the limbs they are thinking of. The hysteric who can only move her legs by using kinesthetic images is paralyzed when she loses these images. If she represents this movement by visual images, she will have movements in her eyelids, eyes, chest, and arms, but not in her legs. In a word, if the idea of a movement is represented in a precise way and by appropriate images, this movement will be carried out in the same way, whether it is a voluntary act or an automatic act. Since the voluntary act cannot be inserted between the idea and the movement, which are always indissolubly united, it is in the idea itself, in the intellectual phenomena proper, that it must be sought. What makes it possible to establish tangible differences between the forms of will is the indisputable fact that their correspondence with the forms of representation, these are much more distinct than the former, or rather they alone are distinct. It is these which give their color to action, which are themselves indeterminate. End quote. Automatic acts are presented to us with 2 degrees of perfection corresponding to 2 degrees of intellectual phenomena, whether they are the expression of simple sensation or isolated images, or they correspond to perceptions already more complex and varied. In order for there to be acts elevated above these last automatic acts, there must be, in the intelligence, phenomena of knowledge superior to perceptions themselves. For our part, we are disposed to believe that judgments or ideas of connection are in the intelligence. Phenomena different from sensations, images, and perception, which are simply groups of images associated with one another. The idea of resemblance, for example, is not a sensation or an image, for it is neither red nor blue, nor warm nor acoustic. Neither is it a group of images, for an addition of this kind would form a new image, and the resemblance cannot in any way be represented. This idea arises in relation to terms presented by the senses or represented successively by association and memory, but it does not seem to be part of the same nature. The image I think of when I see Peter and Paul is not the exact resemblance of either Peter or Paul. Truth, beauty, morality are, in my mind, something different from objects themselves about which I have these conceptions. Aesthetic judgment is not the same as a mosaic of pleasant sensations given side by side. Whether we call these new phenomena reflections, as Mandelbrot does, or apperceptions, as Wundt calls them, following Leibniz, or simply judgments, it does not matter, as long as they are not confused with psychological phenomena. I make no pretense of addressing the theory of judgment, which forms, in my opinion, the key point of contemporary psychology, and which most separates psychologists today. I am simply repeating the conclusions which have already been brilliantly supported by several authors, particularly Rabier. I only wish to point out that if we erase this distinction between judgment and image, we thereby eliminate any possible separation between voluntary acts and automatic acts. For voluntary acts are precisely those which are determined by judgments and ideas of connection. And here Janet summarizes all that we just read and that I paraphrased and says, "We perform daily acts which are absolutely identical to those which we made our sleepwalkers perform by means of suggestion. And yet we say that our acts are voluntary and theirs are automatic. There was something more in our mind than in theirs at the time when the act was executed. Like them, in our thoughts, we have the representative image of the act to be carried out. But they enact it only because they have the image in mind. We perform it because we also judge whether it is useful or necessary. The subject automatically copies the movement of my arm while I voluntarily copy a drawing. The subject does the act solely because she thinks of the image of this act and without judging that she is doing it, an action similar to mine. I copy while thinking of the resemblance and because of it." Quote, "Instead of acting similarly in similar cases," says Fiole, "by a pure automatism like an animal, without any awareness of similitude, he will act similarly in similar cases with awareness of similitude, that is to say, with a feeling of resemblance strong enough to be reflected upon and pictured. The subject utters such words because they pass through their minds in the absence of any others. We speak thus because we judge it to be true. In short, without worrying about the nature of judgments or how they determine action, we are saying that there is only voluntary activity when it occurs." How does judgment determine activity? Is it in the same way that images and perceptions necessarily translate themselves to the outside by particular movements? That hardly seems intelligible. The idea of resemblance, beauty, or truth is, in reality, not linked with any determined movement. Indeed, it should not be said too easily, as certain authors do, that the idea of a connection is related to the movement of articulation of a certain word. If this were so, the idea of connection could never provoke acts other than words, and we know that it can determine any act. Besides, speech is determined by the visual or auditory images of the word resemblance, and not by the idea of connection that expresses it. It seems to me more correct to say that ideas of connection are not driving forces in themselves, but that they stop and unite in the mind, in a word, that they synthesize in a new way a certain number of real images which themselves have driving power. Voluntary effort would consist precisely in this systematization around the same relationship of images and memories, which will then be expressed automatically. The weakness of synthesis, which we have recognized in patients, does not even allow them the elementary syntheses which form personal perceptions. And more particularly, it does not allow the higher syntheses which are necessary for voluntary activity. The author, who have made quite a complete study of the mechanism by which attention is developed and maintained, have perhaps not sufficiently insisted on the role of judgment in attention. For it is that intervention which in our opinion characterizes true voluntary attention. In short, it does not seem to us that there is reason to establish any greater difference between voluntary activity and voluntary belief. On either side, intelligent judgment, because it brings them together strongly, serves to keep in mind different images which will then be expressed in one case by action, in the other by simple words. Whatever the case may be with this mechanism of voluntary activity, determined by judgment, it possesses certain characteristics. First, it presents a unity and a much greater harmony than automatic activity. In fact, the latter, coming from a rather weak synthesis which brings together only a small number of images, does not maintain its focus for long. It manifests one perception, then another, which has no relation to the first. It seems, as a whole, very uncoordinated and variable. Has anyone ever successfully given a sleepwalker a suggestion, the execution of which was delayed for 15 days? On the contrary, there is nothing more common than a voluntary resolution, such as writing a book or establishing a successful business, that will last for years. Moreover, one of the principal judgments that we apply, rightly or wrongly, to our own psychological phenomena is that of unity. We notice our unity and we increase it because we have noticed it. While automatic activity leads through several different psychological existences, voluntary activity tends to make unity reign in the mind and make real the ideal of the philosopher, the soul, one and the same. As long as the action is determined only by images, it is necessarily individual and self-serving, because a perception, an image, is always a specific individual phenomena which has no existence or value outside of itself. One who yields to the vertigo of representation produces an action whose nature is both narrow and personal, just like the sensations which give rise to it. But ideas of connection are something else. They alone are susceptible to generality, for they can remain the same and yet apply to many different terms. The activity determined by such ideas broadens, although composed of elements which in themselves are distinct phenomena. In its form, it has the common direction imposed on all these movements, a meaning and a general scope, just as each syllable which an orator utters is a specific phenomena, while their sentence is a universal conception, so the action which brings about a scientific discovery or creates a work of art participates in something universal. An automatic act has no value outside of itself. A voluntary act can become beautiful, true, moral, and in its highest degree, as one of the great philosophers has said, quote, merge with the will of the universal and with morality. Quoted from Foulé's 1884 book, Liberty and Determinism. Finally, the automatic act is rigorously fixed because it is a sudden expression, without any modification, of the phenomena which currently exists in the mind of the subject. Whether it depends on a single isolated image, or whether it is the result of a large number of phenomena, of a whole psychological situation, it has various degrees of complexity. Nevertheless, it is just as fixed and can be just as easily calculated. But when it is the consequence of a judgment and a general idea, it acquires real independence. Without doubt, it is always the translation of the judgment itself, for the movement is never independent of the idea, since they are two identical things, or better, the same thing considered from two different points of view. But this judgment itself was not contained in the previous image and in the given psychological situation. Here is a new and unexpected phenomena resembling consciousness itself, appearing in the midst of the phenomena of mechanical movement and in relation to them. It is something indeterminate and free. It is because the act is intelligent, universal, and moral that it becomes free. There is nothing more free. I do not say this in an absolute way, which would be meaningless, but as it relates to reason and to human sciences, that what cannot be foreseen, that for which the outcome is beyond our comprehension. A great scientific discovery which upsets science cannot be foreseen by current science, since, by definition, it does not yet exist. A discovery of this kind is something original, new, something which did not exist before. It is, if not in its substance, at least in its form, and in its new synthesis it imposes on the elements, a real creation ex nihilo. Now, this idea only exists when it is realized in a book, or in a work of art, or in an intellectual act. It is an illusion of the weak-minded to believe that they feel, deep in their heart, sublime ideas which they cannot bring to realization. If their idea was determined, if it really existed, their limbs would move on their own to carry it out. Is not the act of a person of genius the freest in the world, insofar as someone is capable of conceiving a personal idea which is not given in the sensations he receives and in the associations previously made, approaches genius and freedom. Conclusion. How could a psychologist like Moreau write this astonishing sentence? Quote, by becoming a mental degenerate, a subject goes through a psychocerebral state which, by continuing to develop, will make him a man of genius. End quote. How could he believe that diseases of the nervous system and even insanity itself strongly favored the development of intelligence? It is probably because of this word, excitement, that he frequently used to designate madness. No, whatever the similarities of external circumstances, madness and genius are at two extremes and opposite ends of psychological development. The entire history of madness, as argued by Balaguer, and after him many alienists, is but the description of psychological automatism left to itself, and this automatism, in all its manifestation, depends on the present weakness of synthesis, which is mental weakness itself, psychological misery. Genius, on the contrary, is a power of synthesis capable of forming entirely new ideas which no previous science has been able to foresee, and is the supreme degree of mental power. Ordinary people oscillate between these two extremes. They are more determined and automatic when their mental strength is weak, and they are more worthy of being considered free and moral beings to the degree of mental strength they possess, although we are unaware of how it grows.